Hello, and welcome to the Faith and Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 10th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of July 28th, 2024. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I am excited that we are in this season now, like we talk about, that Pentecost is a growing season where we really get to focus on some of the growth. And this week we get a very familiar story, but we get John's take on it. So it's always interesting to kind of see what John brings up. But I think this is a story, especially with the additional texts that we have this week, that are very challenging. And I think it's a good challenge. I think it's a challenge that forces us to be very observant, forces us to be good scientists, forces us to be thoughtful and considerate and slow down and really think through our actions. And I think that's something that is very difficult for us. I think it's so much easier for us to draw lines and to say, you're on this side, I'm on that side. And we realize that humanity really isn't that black and white, that humanity is a lot of shades of gray. And that means that we need to be able to work within that framework. And I think there is an intention that God does have where, yes, this is my guidelines, but realize that I created different types of people. Realize I created different types of things. Realize when I go out into nature, things aren't necessarily just one way or the other, that they're part of this group or that group. And I think that's really important. And it gets to the question that we had for last week is, have you thought outside the box to be able to work together? And I think that's a really important question because I think it forces us to realize the way that we're always thinking, the way that we think about things isn't necessarily the way that everybody else thinks about things. And if they are all children of God, we have to be respectful and realize that just because you see something as black and white doesn't mean that everyone else sees it that way. And I think that means from both sides that it's worth spending respectful conversations about and really honing in and listening to what God wants to say, not necessarily what the self wants it to be. And I think a lot of times the self wants things to be simple and easy and black and white. And I think there's a lot of times that it isn't that easy. And I think we'll get into that a little bit more this week, actually, when we get into their science tie-in. So there's your tease this week. We will have some things where it's not easy black and white stuff. And that makes it hard for us in humanity sometimes. But I think it's also an opportunity for us to really grow and learn and think deeply about things, which is also very good. And I think it helps us grow in our understanding of who God is. So let's just jump into it. The semi-continuous Old Testament text this week is from 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 to 15. This is the story where David royally messes up. And it's one of the moments that we get to see David as human. David not in this elevated stance, but this very human aspect of David. David is up on the roof, observes a woman bathing. He then lies with her and she becomes pregnant. He then finds out she's a married woman and that her husband is on the front line. So David devises a couple different plans to be able to try to woos his way, putting him in the front line and having everyone back off. But before that, even bringing him home just so that he could lie with his wife, and he doesn't do it because he's loyal to the group of people, his soldiers that he's with, that if they're lying on the ground, so should I, and I shouldn't be enjoying time with my wife while all my other comrades are not. So it's this moment where we see David mess up and David get caught up with the self. And it ties in, I think, very interestingly into the other text that we'll have this week. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 14, all 7 verses of it. And this is a psalm that then kind of plays with that theme that we get in 2 Samuel, where often as humans, we can get full of ourselves and we forget to look to God for knowledge and guidance, and realizing that God is the one who is doing that, not us. And so in doing that, if we get pulled in thinking that we are doing all of this, then we really become fools. We realize eventually that all these things that we were perceiving ourselves to be were gifts from God, and that God was giving us the guidance for that. And so this psalm then gets this aspect of how Israel needs to be looking for this and depending on the guidance from God and not necessarily depending purely on the self. The other Old Testament text this week is from 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 42 to 44. This sets up what we'll be going through in John very well, but it's Elisha is with a man and a large group of people and has 20 barley loaves, but there's 100 people in which they need to feed, and some fresh ears of grain. And Elijah trusts in God that there is going to be an abundance, and go and give them, and they had more than enough to eat. And this is trusting in what God has told them and trusting in what God is giving them. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 145, verses 10 to 18. This then is a thanks and praise psalm, as you would imagine, but it's this recognition that it's God's kingdom. It's the recognition that God is in control. It's that God is doing all these things. God is satisfying our hearts. God is the one that is in control and is trying to pass these knowledge and ways of living on to future generations so that the kingdom of God may grow. Not necessarily the self, it's looking at it from God is the one in control and I am a vessel in which God is using. The epistle text this week is from Ephesians chapter 3, verses 14 to 21. This then is a prayer that kind of continues that theme, that God is the one in glory and is strengthening us through the Spirit that dwells within us so that we may be able to comprehend the breadth and length and height and depth of what the knowledge that God has for us and the love that God has for us, and comprehend what the saints have been able to do, and that none of this is able to happen on our own accord. That this is stuff that God is giving for us to be able to give to future generations. The gospel text this week is out of John chapter 6, the first 21 verses of it. There's kind of two very familiar stories here. First, we have Jesus. He's by the Sea of Tiberias. There is a large crowd that has gathered, the healing of sick, and are wanting to hear what Jesus has to say. And it's the Passover festival. So he goes and asks his disciples to see if there's anything out there for people to eat. And first, they were like, there isn't enough food in town here if we had to feed all these people. And so what they find is that there is a person, a boy, who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus, it's kind of a mockery. It's kind of like, this boy has 5 barley loaves, 2 fish. There's 5,000 people here. And granted, remember the counting systems at this time, we're counting men. We're not necessarily counting women and children. So there very well could have been over 10. But Jesus tells them to sit down. Jesus then blesses that and distributes it. And I think that this is part of the miracle, is that they see the selfless act of the boy, and that people probably shared more food additionally, but they were able to collect 12 baskets full of food afterwards. And so seeing the blessing of what God is able to do, recognizing that God is able to take what seems like insignificant and make something super significant, way beyond. But then they get into a whole nother story here for the last 6 verses. The disciples then are going to cross the sea, and they're in a boat in Capernaum. And remember, a lot of them are fishermen. Jesus is not yet with them. The sea becomes rough, the wind is blowing, and they have rowed about 3 or 4 miles, and then they see Jesus walking on the sea. Jesus says, "It is I, do not be afraid." Jesus then enters the boat, and immediately they reach the land in which they were going. So this recognition on how sometimes here we try doing things on our own, and yet God then comes in and surprises us. And I think that's a whole nother thing that we'll get into a little bit this week. But before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs. But Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some guidance, direction, and different ideas to be able to think about for the podcast. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy the different resources over there. The art, the hymns, the liturgical prayers, the different daily devotions. I will say they just went through a major revamp on their page. There are certain aspects that I like about it. There are certain things that I'm not as big of a fan of, but it's still an amazing resource over there. And so if you haven't checked that out, I'd highly recommend checking that out. There's a lot of great resources over there. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is a newsletter that either comes out weekly or monthly, or sign up for both, that goes through different lectionary preaching ideas for ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies, which I find really good. But I also really enjoy their monthly newsletter that gives a lot of different ideas, different tips, different things that are going on, more geared for the upper Midwest of the United States, but it's also just great stuff to kind of hear what's going on around the world. And so I'd highly recommend checking out both the Green Blades Rising publications and the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable. That will be the first link down in the show notes. When looking at the text this week, I feel that there is this great chasm that we are trying to bridge this week. The recognition of God providing abundantly, and how we often try either taking credit or figuring out our own methods and solutions, and how that can make things more difficult or make it harder for us. And I think that summarizes this stuff really well. And I found a really good one that we're actively still working on. And I think that means that there's a lot of deep thought that we need to have. But I think it also forces us to slow down and recognize the beauty of what God has done in order for us to better appreciate, better understand, and then better be able to make decisions moving forward. Remember, we are gardeners. We take care of this place. It is not our own. The example that I want to look at this week is salmon, and we're going to focus on salmon running specifically in the northwest of the United States. So let's give a little history here. Salmon runs in the northwestern part of the United States, in the Washington, Oregon area, especially with the Columbia River, used to have thousands and on the edge of millions of fish running through. And it's this crazy life cycle that salmon run in. Salmon spend their life both between freshwater and saltwater. They're one of the few fish that really do this. So first, you have the fish spawning in these rocky beds, and they can go as far into these little creeks and canals and areas into Idaho, which is hundreds of miles from the coast of the United States, going up these streams to lay their eggs and fertilize them. The fish, the fry, then will make the journey back slowly to the ocean to spend a few years in the ocean. And as they approach the end of their life, they have this desire to go back home one more time. And so then they make the treacherous journey going against the current, going upstream to get back to where it all began. And the beautiful thing with this is, one, multiple different species of salmon would do this, but because of the different areas in which these salmon would lay their eggs and grow up, you had a lot of genetic diversity based on water temperature, based on different threats that they would be acknowledging and happening, and it allowed for a lot of genetic diversity within salmon. And if you go back in the records 150 years ago, like I stated, there was a lot of fish that were running through, and this became major parts of even the Native American culture and part of treaties that were made with the United States, and how the Native Americans would give up their land in order that they can keep their fishing. Well, 150 years ago as white immigrants started to immigrate into that section, and they were going for lumber, they were going for gold, they were going for beaver pelts, and they were going for salmon. And as salmon continued to be harvested and figured out ways to be able to can it so that it could be shipped all over the country, we overfished it. And as we were overfishing it, we then started realizing, well, maybe we could do a better job. Maybe we can do this. So we decided to fisheries it up. We were going to harvest the eggs from the females and the sperm from the males and be able to fertilize these eggs. And we were seeing initially, this looked like a great idea. We could crack the code. We could have abundant fish forever. Because in nature, a small percentage, of single digits probably, of fish that actually make it all the way to breeding. And thus, we were able to actually get in the fisheries, we were getting 90% survival rate. And that's a huge step, at least at the beginning. Like, if we can get them to the fry stage or the little par stage and release them, like, this could be huge. The problem in that is we forgot a few different things. We've talked about in this podcast before multiple times, keystone species. Keystone species are species that have significant impact on their environments way beyond what we would anticipate that they do. One of the things that salmon do is when you have the adults going to spawn, they spawn once. Once they have spawned, they are going to die near where they grew up. This desire to go back home. But what does that actually do? Their whole trek, both ways, is a dangerous one. And heck, even being out in the ocean is still dangerous. You have bears and feeding bears. And if the bear gets a fish, where is it going to defecate? In the woods. So it's bringing that ocean water, all the nutrients from the sea, and bringing it to areas that wouldn't otherwise get it. There's all the little protozoans that are eating the dead fish that has been able to spawn that then become the food for the fry. You have this life cycle that the nutrients of the salmon was touching everything from the trees to the animals all around to the streams itself, helping keeping them healthy and ready to go. As we were developing in the Pacific Northwest the idea that we were able to do this all in fisheries, we also then decided that damming the river multiple times was the way to go. What that has caused is now, as we continue to see salmon being, almost all salmon species of the Northwest are at least on the threatened list, if not the endangered species list, and we're monitoring them closely, it has meant that we are doing lots of additional work. For instance, sea lions will also go up these rivers, and because they are then trying to get a snack, and we're trying to save as many salmon because the numbers are so low, they're then trying to scare the sea lions by shooting dummy rounds or blanks or rubber bullets to try to get the sea lions to go back to the ocean, which is another endangered species, threatened species. You have some of these dams that have also created dead water, which then has created a whole industry of the northern pike minnow sport fishing, because these pike minnows, which are another native species, are eating specifically the fry as they are coming through after having to stop at the dams and trying to recover because they've either gone through the currents or they're sitting and waiting to be able to get the confidence to go through these fish-friendly dams that have the rapids for them to go through. This is then caused where you're putting thousands and millions of dollars into it, where there's in a PBS documentary that's, again, almost 10 years old, but it's still quite good to at least give an idea of what has gone on, that there's whole fishing guides who would give up a whole section of the year just to fish these fish because the income is so good, because they're paying per fish, because they're trying to keep these populations low so that the salmon can keep going. And because the salmon are so low, you have to be able to control these things. And that doesn't even include that there's still some of these dams that are unpassable for the salmon, so they can't even get back to these areas, which then you're taking that keystone species and that nutrients that could go into that ecosystem that it makes it uninhabitable for that to happen. And we don't know what the long-term ramifications are for some of these areas that aren't able to get into that, as early studies are starting to be done to see what all goes on with that. What has this done? It has meant that we have actually started to look at opening up some of the different dams, but it's also forcing us to think about and reconsider, maybe we need to figure out different ways of doing dams, or think about, is there just better ways for us to get electricity other than damming these important rivers for these fish? Especially if we're going to say it's so important culturally, both to the Native Americans and to everyone else who has immigrated there, and to the environment in and of itself. There is a lot to get into with this issue. So let's go back to our text for a moment. We have these ideas as humans that sometimes we can do it better. Take David, for instance. David realizes that he screwed up with Bathsheba. So then he tries to devolve this whole plan for Uriah to die. And then Uriah is such a good soldier that it just causes more problems for David. And he is spending a tremendous amount of time, work, and effort thinking about this. When if David had done the right thing initially, there wouldn't have been this problem. We are spending a crap ton of money figuring out dams, figuring out what fish can be around other fish, making sure that we have sea lions out of the way to make sure the salmons are running, because we realize how important they are to the ecosystem in Oregon and Washington and into Idaho. But if we had spent the time initially, would we still have that problem? One of the things that is starting to be done is actually, instead of transporting some of these fish into the fisheries to be able to get the sperm and eggs and be able to raise them in the fisheries, some of these fish are just getting fast-tracked up into these areas to see if they can re-inhabit some of these areas that used to have salmon and see how that works. See if we can get some of the genetic diversity back instead of having only fisheries salmon. Yes, you had a 90% success rate, but there isn't a ton of genetic diversity when they're all coming from the same parents. We have to realize that we have to trust on God. And sometimes, yes, we can trust our understanding, but we have to also be working with God in that, not trying to work our way around God. In a lot of ways with how we are doing salmon, we are still trying to figure out and how do we fix and help repair the damage that we've done, and realizing that the best thing to do is probably try bringing it as close back to the native and natural way that it used to be able to help the whole ecosystem as a whole. But that also means that we have to take this leap of faith. We have to take this leap of faith to understand that God is still going to do God's part. That God is not going to let this fish that has been so important for this ecosystem just necessarily to disappear. We have to take some work and effort to try to help it, but we also have to have the faith and trust to let it go and let nature do what nature has always done. And so, yes, that might mean us repairing streams, bringing them back from trying to straighten them out, to getting rid of dams or figuring out different ways for the fish to be able to coexist with the dams well. It means that we need to be monitoring and being careful and thinking about how our impacts is affecting the salmon and how that affects a whole region, not just for food supply for people, but food and the plants and ecosystems in which these fish inhabit. I think it also is a reminder for all of us as well as the impact of each of us. Realizing that we have to allow God to be able to work through us, but realizing also the impact that we can each have. It's a fine balance. It means sometimes that we can't always have it our own way because it isn't our world, it's God's. And if that's the case, then we need to treat it that way, and we need to respect it that way, and we need to acknowledge it that way. That's sometimes really hard for us to acknowledge and work with. We like having control, but yet that's where we get scared. When things don't go our way and we start trying to take it in and we start realizing that there's more problems. And at what point do we realize and just give it, and then Jesus shows up walking on the water? It is I. Do not be afraid. Trust me. Now do as I have instructed you to do, to take care of this place, to recognize what is going on and allow nature to do nature things. It doesn't mean that we totally get rid of fisheries. There is a value to some of that, but we can't become dependent on it. It means that we need to acknowledge the impact of what different things have within an ecosystem. We have to be able to work with and acknowledge and figure it out slowly. It means that we need to proceed with more caution. We need to recognize that maybe we need to figure out other ways of producing our electricity in that area than just depending on dams, so that the fish can let the current bring them back to sea, as they have done for generations and generations for the fish. To allow some of our native neighbors to be able to practice what they have done for centuries, and in what, as the United States, we signed treaties to allow them to do, to make sure that the fish are actually there for them to be able to do their practices. That's us also being good neighbors. That is us being able to share the bounty, not just hoard the bounty. We have to acknowledge and recognize that God working through us, and recognize that it's not our own thought. It's not us outsmarting the system. It's us working together with God. It's us acknowledging God working, and us acknowledging the revelations that we're understanding about what's going on out in nature is God parting knowledge to us. And in that, then we might start to see some of the miracles of what might happen. I'll let you do some of your own research in little bits and pieces that I have found in some of the dams that have been taken down on different parts of the riverways that lead into the Columbia River. As these dams have been taken down, it is amazing to see the salmon start to recover. Watching numbers increase slowly and steadily, but not necessarily in a linear line, but still growth. Up years and down years, but the overall trend growing up. But we still have to be careful. We still have to acknowledge. We still have to be cautious of what we are doing. So the question I have for you this week is, where are you acknowledging impact around you? Human or non-human? Where are you acknowledging impact around you? Human or non-human? I think one of the things that being in the United States, being in an area that I am, that there is different Native American tribes and reservations around me, and the thing that growing up around that, I've always been fascinated with, is the acknowledgement that they make with seasons and recognizing the passing of time, but also recognizing then how that affects everything around them, and realizing how all the stuff is connected, and being able to see and respect and acknowledge that around us. And I think as people, and especially in a world that is becoming more and more globalized, I think that's going to be a key for us. And I think it's a key for us to also acknowledge how God then works in that, how God works in migration, how God works in seasons. We talk about seasons of faith. Do we really acknowledge it? Do we acknowledge the seasons around us? Or do we just like throwing the term around? I think these are things for us to be thinking about and considering. And when we're looking at how important a salmon fish can be to a whole ecosystem hundreds of miles from the coast of where they spent most of their lives, is impressive. But I also feel this longing, and maybe it's just the age that I'm at, but it's just heartbreaking to me that we have these fish that their last thing that they're trying to do is just go back home one more time. And we as humans have made it the hard and difficult journey that it already was harder, if not impossible, for them to do. And I think there is a part of that as we acknowledge that and sit with that, and we understand that that's not what many of us would feel is fair, that many of us would see as fair. So then maybe we should try to make sure that nature can do the same things of the privileges that many of us would want to do as well. And I know we're not home yet, and we're not necessarily going to be fully home in this lifetime. But I think we can also appreciate the home and homes that we have in this life are still really important to us. And there is, for many of us, a drawing to go back, especially as time nears its end, that we want to make sure to go back one more time. And I think we should make sure that others, human and non-human, that have that same desire should be able to do that as well. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.